The modern imagination often envisions Aristotle as a grand, towering figure, a philosopher so monumental in mind and achievement that he must also have been monumental in body, a man carved in white marble, features idealized, posture erect, a presence commanding awe simply through the dignity of his physical form. Artistic depictions, from Renaissance busts to neoclassical paintings, present him as the embodiment of Greek ideals, broad-shouldered, muscular, symmetrical, with a calm, composed expression that mirrors the authority and permanence of his ideas. Yet when we turn to the accounts of those who actually encountered Aristotle in his lifetime, a strikingly different image emerges. One that contradicts centuries of sculptural and artistic idealization. To the people of Athens and beyond, Aristotle was small, thin, and delicate, almost fragile in appearance. His shoulders were narrow, his limbs slender, his posture not the poised, heroic stance of a god or athlete but the slightly hunched, careful carriage of someone accustomed to long hours of thought rather than exertion. His body seemed constructed not for feats of strength but for intellectual labor, a vessel honed for sustained concentration rather than physical prowess. His eyes, often mentioned in historical sources, were small yet intensely observant. Perhaps slightly sunken, they conveyed a restless, analytical energy rather than the calm confidence later attributed to him by sculptors. Those who studied or walked alongside him described them as sharp, constantly flicking from one object to another, a mind perpetually engaged with the world and the questions it posed. There was a penetrative quality in his gaze, an intensity that commanded attention without relying on size or volume. It was as if the depth and precision of thought could be projected not through grand gestures or physical dominance, but through the sheer force of concentrated observation. Equally surprising was his voice. Contrary to expectations of a philosopher's resonance, deep, sonorous, capable of filling a hall and commanding immediate deference, Aristotle spoke with a quick, high-pitched, somewhat nasal tone. Accounts suggest that his speech was rapid, almost impatient, as if the torrent of ideas inside his mind struggled to keep pace with his tongue. The very physicality of his voice reflected the nature of his intellect, precise, analytical, finely tuned, always racing ahead of conventional expression. Ancient writers mention this peculiarity often enough for it to become part of his historical identity, indicating that contemporaries found it as memorable as it was unusual. Here was the man whose words would ultimately codify logic, ethics, and natural science, yet he delivered them not with theatrical resonance but with the sharp efficiency of thought translated directly into speech. The divergence between this real figure and the monumental images of later centuries is not accidental. Artists across the Hellenistic, Roman, and Renaissance periods were deeply invested in visual ideals, symmetry, proportion, physical strength, and an aura of stability and authority. Frailness, narrowness, or a high-pitched voice did not conform to the cultural expectations of heroism or greatness. In sculpting philosophers, these artists often superimposed societal ideals onto historical figures, creating statues that aligned mental prowess with imagined bodily perfection. Thus, generations grew up learning Aristotle not as he truly was, but as a figure whose outer form seemed as immutable and commanding as his intellectual output, a representation of wisdom rendered in marble. Yet, in reality, the philosopher was almost antithetical to this vision, a man whose physical presence was unassuming, almost overlooked, yet whose mind, voice, and intensity radiated far beyond the corporeal shell. Despite his small stature and delicate frame, Aristotle possessed a physical presence in motion that was remarkably commanding. His gestures were animated, his movements purposeful, his energy almost kinetic. He did not remain seated as many teachers of his day might have. Instead, he walked, lectured, gestured, and demonstrated. The Lyceum, the peripatetic school, was named for this very habit of walking while teaching. Students and fellow philosophers followed him along colonnades and courtyards, attempting to keep pace with his energetic strides and the cascade of ideas that accompanied them. In this sense, his physical presence was inseparable from his pedagogical method. The slight, slender man in motion, carrying scrolls, specimens, and instruments, became a vector for intellectual energy, translating the power of thought into a tangible, spatial, almost performative experience. His thin frame did not diminish the intensity of his influence, rather, it highlighted it, emphasizing that intellectual authority can manifest in ways wholly unrelated to physical size or conventional aesthetic expectations. This image also offers insight into the cultural context of ancient Greece. A society renowned for its celebration of athleticism, physical perfection, and theatrical oratory might easily have overlooked someone like Aristotle. Strength, symmetry, and projection of voice were valued both in the public assembly and in the gymnasium. Yet here was a man whose impact derived entirely from his mind, whose achievements altered the intellectual fabric of the world without ever conforming to the physical ideals admired by his contemporaries. In a way, Aristotle becomes an emblem of the triumph of intellect over bodily expectation, a demonstration that revolutionary ideas and enduring influence can emerge from the unlikeliest physical vessels. Aristotle's unidealized appearance may also illuminate aspects of his intellectual methodology. The man who was physically slight and acutely aware of his own corporeal limitations did not chase perfection in abstraction alone, he looked to the observable, tangible, and flawed world around him. In biology, he documented the diversity and imperfection of living forms with meticulous care. In ethics, he emphasized practical virtue over idealized moral forms. In political theory, he analyzed constitutions as they existed rather than as they might be imagined. Perhaps his experience of being, in a sense, outside societal ideals allowed him a clarity of vision. He understood the reality of the imperfect, the provisional, the contingent, and he translated that understanding into a philosophy rooted in observation and careful reasoning rather than mythic idealization. Even his voice, described as thin, high-pitched, and nasal, assumes a new significance when considered alongside his intellectual legacy. What might have been considered a weakness became, in effect, an instrument finely tuned to the rapid transmission of complex ideas. The cadence of his speech mirrored the structure of his thought, quick, precise, analytical, almost mathematical in its progression. Listeners were compelled not by dramatic oratory but by the clarity, subtlety, and depth of the ideas themselves. The disjunction between physical expectation and intellectual reality reinforces the notion that the human mind is not constrained by the external forms of its vessel. Moreover, Aristotle's real appearance, his slight body, restless eyes, and energetic movement, underscores a broader lesson about historical memory. Human culture has a long tendency to sculpt its heroes, to smooth the imperfections, and to align achievement with ideals of grandeur. Statues and paintings convey aspiration as much as reality, shaping generations' understanding of what greatness looks like. By returning to the descriptions of contemporaries, however, we encounter a far more intriguing figure, a tiny, sharp-eyed, animated thinker whose physical limitations did not hinder, but perhaps even enhanced, his capacity for observation, engagement, and innovation. The disparity between mythologized form and historical fact adds depth to our understanding. Aristotle's brilliance was not amplified by size, voice, or imposing physicality, but by the sheer force of his intellect, curiosity, and analytical rigor. In walking through the Lyceum, pacing under the colonnades with scrolls in hand, Aristotle embodied a different kind of grandeur, one of thought in motion, of inquiry enacted in real time. His presence was not that of an imposing physical figure but of a restless, penetrating mind that demanded engagement, provoked questions, and reshaped the contours of knowledge itself. The small, frail body and high-pitched, rapid voice become, in retrospect, almost ironic instruments of his genius. They highlight the contrast between expectation and reality, between the external forms that society prizes and the internal capacities that define enduring achievement. Ultimately, the real Aristotle challenges the assumptions we carry about greatness. He demonstrates that influence, authority, and transformative power do not necessarily correspond to the size of the body or the majesty of voice. He shows that the depth of observation, the precision of thought, and the energy of engagement can create a presence far more potent than physical grandeur. By acknowledging the truth of his appearance alongside the immensity of his intellect, we gain a richer, more human understanding of one of history's greatest minds, a small, delicate, restless man, moving rapidly through thought and space, eyes flicking, mind racing, voice high-pitched, whose influence would echo through millennia. Proving that true authority resides in the mind, not the form.